Was your conversations with Chief Justice Vinson on baseball. And I knew you threw it out there just sort of as a little vignette regarding Vinson's interest, but it's really well known that he had more than just a casual interest in baseball. How did he impart that in the office? Did he talk a lot about baseball?
Occasionally we heard about his college exploits and how he fielded on second base. And occasionally we had comments on what was going on in the major leagues and who, other than Washington, might have good prospects for the title. Washington, of course, never had good prospects in those days. It was a part of his life, I think. He was actually, according to his biographers, a very good athlete in his college days. All that had turned around, and he was really in very bad physical shape, didn't get enough exercise in the court. That was plain, and probably put down a little too much alcohol in relation to his lack of exercise. Smoked steadily, had a little spittoon like Sherman Minton right there, and spit out the remains of a cigarette and get a new one out.
Did, among the court members themselves, was there notes passed back and forth during the World Series, for example, which, of course, the first week of October, that would have been in the middle of the World Series. Was that a conversation?
Not that I know of,
okay.
No. I don't know who else was an enthusiast baseball on the court. Probably Minton, but I don't remember anything about that.
At that time, did the either the 51 term or the 52 term was the time when the antitrust case came up, Toolson. Do you recall that at all? The New York Yankees Toolson case, I believe.
Well, I can't remember the name of the antitrust case that was argued, and I think I did mention this anecdote about Minton. But I can't remember another. In fact, I can't really remember the legal issues other than the broad fact that whether baseball is to be put under the antitrust laws.
It was revisiting a case from the 20s.
That's right.
Called National Baseball or Federal Baseball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Holmes wrote the...
Holmes wrote the opinion.
And I don't know, have you read that opinion?
Yeah, once upon a time. It basically says that baseball is not interstate commerce.
Yes.
It's a diversion, recreation, not a commercial activity, and thus beyond National Commerce Clause power.
Yeah, and he described how there are clubs and players in them, and they travel around, and this you'll find with their balls and their bats.
Right.
And it's a sport, not an activity.
Well, and you you had a quick vignette, I think, that you overheard a conversation, I don't know if it was with Frankfurter and Vincent regarding...
Actually, I think Frankfurter was giving the court a lecture on Holmes, and Holmes knew when it was time to overrule a decision, even if it was his own decision. And it was an explanation for why he was not going to follow Holmes of 1920, but do what Holmes of 1950 would do.
This is really in the conference room, and you've got your ears kind of near the door?
This is, he was saying enough, in a shrill voice, and Holmes, Holmes, kept repeating or hearing Holmes, and so you could kind of piece together what he obviously was saying, I think. Then this worm. And everything went quiet, and booming voice of Sherman Minton, and that was it.
And for the tape, what did he say? What was Minton's response?
Bullshit. Bullshit, Felix.
And he felt it was a sport?
Oh, yeah, yeah, national sport. Every little boy, even little girls, play baseball. Something like that.
Well, to this day, it exists. It's the only national or major league sport that still has an antitrust exemption.
For better or for worse, I guess.
It makes no sense, but it exists. We asked the question of all of the clerks. If they had to work with one justice other than the one you had, in this case Chief Justice Vinson, who would you select and why?
Well, I've never really thought about that. I did get impressions from all of our friends and colleagues about what it's like to work with their judge or another. And I suppose there are pros and cons, in my mind, seem to be with each. If you really wanted a rather profound kind of, let me say, jurisprudential experience, Frankfurter would, I think, be a very real one. I mean, he sees these cases not only in a practical vein, but in a broader academic vein, likes to think about them and
Right.
get his clerks to learn, and sometimes gives his clerks very fascinating assignments that have very little to do with any particular case. Frankfurter would have been out for me because he always chose Harvard people, recommended by Paul Freund then, although his one exception was a Penn student whom I had taught when I was very green, wet behind the ears at Penn, named Anthony Amsterdam, Tony Amsterdam.
It's a pretty good exception.
Was a unique exception, and he enjoyed his work very much. I forget what it was. He didn't work on individual cases that I know, but he had a very interesting project that Felix seemed to think was important.
Quick digression on Amsterdam. As a student, you as his teacher, was he the supernova of your teaching career?
Well, in some ways, yeah. I remember a little later when I think Tony went up to Yale to be interviewed, and my friend, good friend Lou Pollock, called and said, "What about this guy Amsterdam?" And I said, I started lavishing praise. And Lou said, "Yeah, but every time he opens his mouth, he gives a press release." That was a little of that. When he was in class, I would sort of say, "Well, what do you have to say about that, Mr. Amsterdam?" Out came a press release. He had brilliant classmates. Jesse Choper went on to be dean of Berkeley. Another was the dean and then president of Temple University in Philadelphia. I can remember some classmates, many from Ethiopia, very unique people, good students. But that's way off the tack. I don't know, Jackson, always fascinates me, and this is not just paying homage to you folks in the institution. He fascinated me because he's had a very diverse career, a very interesting background, extraordinarily able, brilliant writer at times, able to drop off a bon mot or a sentence that really grabbed you, and so on. I don't know. I've never had a really good impression from Bill Rehnquist or anybody else about what it's like to work as a law clerk. What do you do? and how much interchange do you have? Responsibility for drafting opinions? I think very little, because opinions of Jackson are so distinctly his style,
Right.
not the pedestrian style of many others. So there, but there are pluses and minuses, I guess, and with every justice, I think.
If you talked about Jackson's style, is it definable?
I suppose it is, but I'm not that well versed in the discipline of criticism to know.
You know it
I
when you
know a
see it.
style when I see it, but I don't know which style it is. We could start with Shakespeare.
Yeah, exactly. You were there for 2 terms.
Right.
On the school segregation issue, yesterday we talked about that which was approached during the 51 term. We talked about Felix Frankfurter coming to lunch and giving his feelings of why it should be put over. And you're there for the next term.
Right.
What was your sense during that next term of where things were going and progressing? And frankly, for the camera, what happened during that 52 term on those desegregation cases?
At this point, I probably tend to get things a little mixed up because there were 2 years of almost the same roadshow. Although my impression is that John W. Davis, our great hero, had represented South Carolina in the first hearing, dropped out of the case. I'm not sure whether that was true. Mm-hmm. But for reasons that have been discussed already, this one was a hot potato. I don't think the court was of an even mind. I think many members of the court were probably very uncertain as to what to do. They were of 2 minds. I do remember having one small conversation with the chief on this. It was during the 2nd year, and it was, when I was about to leave, so I felt a little more licensed to open up a subject with him.
Well, and in the 2nd year, you are the chief law clerk.
Yeah, for whatever that's worth. Well, it's worth a little more money.
Right. And who were your co-clerks in that 2nd year?
Bill Oliver and I don't know why I'm blocking on this. He teaches at Brigham Young Law School, was a dedicated Mormon. And it'll come to me in a minute. I'm sorry, you must think I'm a fading idiot, but these things sometimes happen. Your memory just blocks out on a name. A guy I can describe very...
Right.
Bill Oliver was a...
Bill Oliver, Carl Hawkins?
Carl Hawkins, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was Buddy Cleveland also?
No.
No, okay. He wasn't a Vincent clerk.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that name doesn't ring a bell.
So it was you, Hawkins, and Oliver.
Yeah, and I can't remember dates. Maybe you have them there. I'm under the impression Carl left before the term was over. But I may be wrong.
Okay, yeah, and there's somebody named Richard Flynn.
Do you have dates on him?
No, the dates aren't very good. And then Earl Pollock arrives in the summer, and then Vincent obviously dies.
Yeah, and I did meet Earl and was sort of helping a little bit. Richard Flynn may have come because of some agreement with the chief to take him on. Was he a Yale graduate?
I don't have any.
If he's a Yale graduate, then there was a guy, and he came and he had an interview, which must have gone very sour with Vincent, and he never was seated.
Okay. So the guy who was your co-clerk, the Mormon BYU. That's
Carl's
Hawkins.
very, very sharp guy.
Still living? Do you know?
I don't know. I really don't know. I haven't had any contact with him. Bill Oliver was the other. I met Bill back in the Supreme Court law clerk's dinner. He seemed in good shape. We reminisced because he was a great friend of the president of Indiana University where he taught. He was the university's tax counsel, Bill was.
Okay.
And I had known his president too from Ethiopian experience.
So you were starting to say that you recall a conversation with the chief.
Good for you. I guess I was. Something, and I just said, it seems to me that there's a great moral issue at stake in these cases. I said, we have to think about morally, what do we owe every human being, something like that. And he paused, he wanted to put this fire out, but he said, well, on the other hand, would it be moral to start a lot of violence in this country? And I always thought, that was an interesting answer. I'm a lapsed Quaker, but I do go to meeting now and then, and I sort of put the question to the meeting. When doing the right thing means stirring up maybe a very terrible storm, harm, what do you do? I guess that's a theme of a lot of literature, too.
If you had to you left in the summer of '53, and the case itself was really percolating along now. If you had to suspect that in that time frame, take a snapshot, how the vote would go, how do you think it would go, and who would be voting for and against?
Well, I guess I thought about that a little. I figured Black, Douglas, probably Jackson, probably Frankfurter reluctantly, just because Felix never wanted to get into all these kinds of cases. And someone else, there must be a majority there, and that the others probably were reluctant, but maybe against it. They didn't want to overrule Plessy versus Ferguson, but maybe they didn't want to reaffirm Plessy so much as they didn't want to get into the effects of overruling it.
Let's back up a little bit. I mean, they had a whole week of argument in December of '52, and they had a conference in December of '52.
Right.
And then it carries through the spring, and at the end of the term, they propound the questions
Right.
and call for additional briefing. So,
Yeah.
what were you privy to, and what do you recall of that sequence?
Alex Bickle, who was an outstanding clerk, of course, and really a very warm friend. And I talked about these things, and it became very clear to me that it was Frankfurter's office that drafted these questions, and persuaded the court that this would be at least a good way to rationalize putting the cases over for another term. I thought the questions were very intelligent. I thought that in my immature, unexperienced mind, but I thought the cases had not been well argued, particularly with all due respect to John W. Davis, and that you needed to get into very much, in a very serious way, the issues that were suggested by those questions. how do we interpret the 14th Amendment in respect of these racial equality issues in light of the vastly changed circumstances of government today. In Plessy's time, even, education was not regarded really, certainly in many parts of the country, as an absolutely sort of essential thing to get ahead in society.
Right. And not much of a government function.
Not much of a government function. In fact, I thought, well, it'd be interesting if somebody could go back and how many public schools were there in the U.S., in the South, and so on at that time. And my impression would be, well, public education still was in its infancy, in spite of efforts in the earlier part of the 19th century to get it started, Massachusetts and so on a systematic scale. And that, of course, found its way into Warren's opinion. It could have found its way in a more, as many things could have, in a more disciplined way. He could have, in a footnote, given some picture of this, which I think is so terribly important. That we're talking about something very different now. And the question is how to apply the Equal Protection Clause to this situation, not a situation as it existed then, and so on. The intentions of the framers, that's sort of a ridiculous question. It always seems to me, how can the framers of an amendment have intentions? Or the same thing as how can Congress? But sometimes you can find out whether education was one of the real concerns. It doesn't appear to me that the history reveals that. At least Alex did then research the history, as you know, and parlayed them into wonderful academic stuff.
Right. Well, what had happened back in December of '52 in the conference? I mean, you clerks must have been you're aware that segregation's a huge case.
Oh, sure.
The justices go into conference, they've got, the 5 cases, the 4 state cases, plus Bowling versus Sharp.
Yeah.
And then, time passes. Didn't you sniff around for what had happened? Did you know what had happened?
I think it was very much as was discussed here by this class of law clerks, that there was no conversation between justice and clerks about this. I think the court had, they'd agreed to solemn, absolute silence on this, only in the conference room, which was probably a wise policy because in a matter like this,
right,
maintaining security and confidence isn't.
Right. What about clerk to clerk? And here's a particular aspect of that. In December of '52, Bill Rehnquist writes Jackson a memo,
Right.
That later becomes famous, called Random Thoughts on the Segregation
Random
Cases.
thoughts, right.
And a random thought on the segregation cases. And it's an argument to retain Plessy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall anything with him
About what, at the time of...
about the segregation cases?
Vaguely. I don't think he ever told me he'd written such a memo to Jackson. And I would have been curious as to why, unless Jackson had specifically said, write me a letter arguing in favor of Plessy, but there was so many briefs and stuff. You might better have said, just distill the essence of these arguments from South Carolina, Kansas brief, etc. But I knew that Bill Rehnquist, from conversations, was at least skeptical, if not opposed to the idea of overruling Plessy. It went with his conservatism generally. And what surprised me when I did have an opportunity to read that from our friend was, I think it's in that memo as well as many others he wrote, the vehemence in which he deplored his liberal clerks and their mislaid views and so on. It wasn't easy to really get along closely with Bill because of his political views. It was his other activities and so on that, was the basis of a good friendship with him, not just an acquaintanceship.
Other activities meaning?
He liked sports, he liked jokes and stuff. And I don't know.
Do you remember from the time what's behind his view favoring Plessy? Why?
I think it has to do with a kind of a conservative ideology. It didn't have so much to do with race or anything like that, but you should never push things radically and try to change the social order. And this is another example of these damn liberal lawyers trying to push the nation into a crisis and stuff like that. I think he did think that liberal lawyers were trying to engineer issues, they couldn't win in Congress, or get over to the courts. I suppose there's a considerable case to be made that was what was going on, but I think just broadly the fact that the African American population out there is a very significant number of people, and that in both practical and moral terms it's absolutely outrageous to tolerate this continuance of segregation. In my wartime experience, towards the end, when we were at Okinawa, and I once saw, I guess, battalion or so of black troops who'd been brought in to truck supplies around. And these guys were facing risks and doing a hard job anyway, of loading, unloading stuff. And there they were, segregated, kind of a badge of inferiority, as some have said. And I think it just shocked me that we, the beacon of democracy, could be doing this. And I know damn well that if one wanted to get active and develop close activities in Africa, you had to ultimately get around to explaining this stain. How could this be done? Because people say, where was the country's conscience?
Well, in the law clerk conversations that you recall with Rehnquist and others, obviously the technical legal questions, 14th Amendment, framers' intent, stare decisis, that's part of it. Do you remember conversations about the moral dimension, the conscience issue?
No, and I must sound like a pompous, pious person or something. I raised these questions, but no, it's a legal issue. The two are different.
Right. Well, but you're going.
We all know law and justice, sir.
Okay, but if your experience at the court causes you at a meeting house to raise for discussion a question there about the moral dimensions, you're not separating it too much. I mean, it's all percolating in you at the same time. That doesn't come out as the clerks are talking to each other in the lunchroom in the court?
I think I didn't want to sound like a pious person too much. I think you know, since it was so overwhelmingly, everybody was in sympathy with the plaintiffs here, that there wasn't much debate about the cases. There were matters of strategy and so on. Dr. Clark's, that evidence was discussed somewhat. The Dahl evidence and the flaws in both the methodology and the obvious flaws in transmitting these results to the whole country.
Do you remember Jackson's other clerk, Don Cronson?
No, you know, I don't. I'm trying to figure out when he must have been there. And
He was there during that 52.
yeah, I know that. I know he's listed, but I'm rather shocked that I can't remember anything about him. Was he there the whole term?
He was there the whole term.
Uh-huh.
But, you know, of course, you were in your second year. Rehnquist was in his second lap. He wasn't there the whole first year.
Right,
But,
no.
you know, was there anybody else who was with you guys as an old timer?
No, we were the only two, that I know.
So maybe it just...
That's what, you know, made
makes
us a
sense
little
that you're
more
point of
attached
contact.
to him because we were holdovers, you know, I knew him and all that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you surprised when you opened up the paper in May of 1954 and read Earl Warren's opinion, how it came out?
Not entirely surprised, just glad that it had come out. And I remember I heard it on the radio. I think I was driving home for lunch. I was then at the University of North Carolina. We lived just outside Chapel Hill. And I started honking my horn as we got in this long driveway. We rented, again, a small house in the country.
Right.
I started honking my horn all the way down the driveway as I came. Peggy came out, and I told her the good news, and we were just, you know, overwhelmingly delighted. Population of Chapel Hill was not. There were some. If I could tell you an aftermath of this,
Sure.
It's related to my court experience. And it's one of the most interesting things in my life, episodes, not terribly long, but the Institute of Government there was headed by a strange old guy, very smart, shrewd, somewhat like Fred Vinson, but very talkative. And he had contacts all over the state people in government. His name was Coates, Albert Coates, and he was known widely. And he had a sort of, within the political realm, a lot of imagination. And he told me, or came to me, I don't know, very shortly after the decision had been announced, and said, get your coat. We're going down to Raleigh. I've got an appointment with Governor Umstead, and I want to talk to him, and I want you to join me for a project. And he explained, now, you're going to write a report on this case, a very objective study. I don't want you tilting one way or another. To explain this decision to the people of North Carolina, and then to tell them what further steps the state might take, and what this damn court's going to do in its next decision. And because, of course, you know the implementation
Right.
part of it. So I said, in effect, do I have any choice? Do I have to? Anyway, we got to Raleigh, to the governor's offices. Umstead was his name, Governor Umstead. He was Ralph Umstead, I think. He was a very level-headed guy, unlike, you know, a typical blowhard governors you think of in so much of the South then. He was saying in the course of conversation, I just don't want this state to blow up in any violence. We've got to keep people calm. And Coates said to him, that's just it, Governor. You're going to appoint a commission. And here's the name of the chairman. I got it all. Pearson is his name. You know, good man. And you're going to tell that commission, don't you do nothing till this young man gives you a report. This sort of, we've taken this action, quiet down, wait till we get the report or something. Then Coates said to me, I don't care what you're doing in law school or somewhere, you drop everything and start writing this report. You're going to sit here all summer because we don't want to rush this thing. And so I wrote it in short. And it was then published by the Institute and elsewhere. Maybe in my bibliography, it's called The School Segregation Decision. And I don't want to brag at all, but the report got in the newspapers all over North Carolina. It got into the New York Times, and editorial page and so on. I tried to, first of all, get across, the decision simply said there could be no segregation, state-required segregation in schools, and that what was to be done had not been decided. I tried to say it's obviously a very complex issue. I went into the problems that various kinds of communities faced in the South, for example, suggested that the state should try to think about this issue and appear as amicus nemici in the next argument, and that there was time to work out a plan, an adjustment to this. Nothing going to be done precipitously. I was sure of that, and that the state, in good conscience, should proceed along those lines. It, for the most part, was well received, although I did get a merciless lecture from a few white supremacists. But I thought that was the most interesting writing project, perhaps, that I ever had. And I sort of regarded, I wouldn't have been assigned to do it, obviously, had I not been a clerk. And fortunately, my judge was from Kentucky and south of the line, and, he must have learned something working for that man.
Sure. I guess similarly in, this would have been May of '55 when the Brown 2, the implementation decision comes down. Were you surprised by that?
No.
No.
No. Not in the least. You suddenly realize it's absolutely impossible for a court to really implement this decision. You hope maybe that Congress would get into the act in due course. I know it's sort of unfashionable to defend the all deliberate speed decision today, but I don't think a lot of people have ever really thought through the problems. Mm-hmm. I did go up and attend the arguments in the second session, and Felix was there, and he had, in the version of my report, the monograph booklet, I had a big spreadsheet that showed the proportion of black population in each county of North Carolina. It was very illustrative. As you go west and into the mountains, the counties become all white, virtually all white. But as you come east into the Cotton Belt, Jesse Helms's territory, it becomes black, majority black population. And to me, my mind, this demonstrated, you see, some of the problems you face on implementation. Part of the state would have no problem at all, nothing to implement.
Sure.
But Felix was sitting there and he opened this sort of map out, you know, broadly showing it all around. I think he had seen me in the audience and sent me a note saying, you know, hello, come see me when this is over, and all that stuff. I guess he wanted to show counsel for North Carolina that he had read this report and he hoped he would speak about it, something like that.
Did they?
The Attorney General of North Carolina, who should have known better, but he was a politically anxious, zealous guy. He wanted to be something more than Attorney General, and he had gubernatorial aspirations. And he turned kind of sour and hit the... he never talked about the report. He simply, you know, took the hard line on segregation, but purely as a political matter. He was a very good lawyer, in fact. I knew him. But
I'm going to flash back a little bit. While you were going through law school, was there a role model, a justice that, as you were reading opinions in your constitutional law course, saying, that's the person I'd like to emulate, or that's the person who, he gets it?
Well, of course, there were the established icons, you know, Holmes, Brandeis, Marshall, some others. On the then contemporary court, I did think Rutledge was an interesting judge, although he hadn't written much then because he hadn't been on that long. Murphy fascinated me because of his diverse background and and how he became a very liberal justice. You have to find your legal grounding, even if you know what your leadings are. You have to begin then to learn how you can put those leadings under or on top of a legal foundation, I think, and that's actually a very interesting problem if one is doing biographical work on judges. We know that they come in with this and that. They don't come in spite of what's said last night, tabula rasa, they do have ideas that soon develop about what's the right thing to do in this and this situation. I think it's impossible to deny that. And then the problem is, well, putting them under, on top of a legal foundation that would be respected and respectable. This is perhaps a great theme of judicial biography. Sorry, rambling.
No.
Murphy was, I think, the guy who interested me. I didn't have a role model. I didn't know I'd ever be down there, you see.
Jackson stories. Are there any Jim Paul, Robert H. Jackson vignettes, a chance encounter, an impression, something that would be of interest?
No, I had sent John the one about the luncheon and my subsequent brief, ill-starred political career.
Yeah. Well, what was that? For the camera, what was that story?
Jackson came down for lunch with the law clerks one time, often, I think several times, but and on this occasion, somehow we got into his political career and how he got started. He explained he was up there in Jamestown, way up state New York, And he was a Democrat, and this was Republican territory. And he said, but I became a very active Democrat, and trying to uphold the party in state elections and so on, fighting for the party. And he said that gave me visibility. And if you really want to get ahead in politics and get into the right place, you've got to have visibility as well as some skill. That's what got me in with FDR. In fact, he's saying this and so on. Washington, Attorney General, onward and upward, sure. Or wherever it is when you go to the court. So that sort of stuck in my mind, not that I had any particular political career interests, but as I told John, somewhere around 1958, the Democrats were running Mayor David Lawrence for governor, and he was a rather formidable man, good candidate, and George Leader for the Senate. George had been governor, and the county chairman of our county, and the county chairman, or at least the boss of Philadelphia, his name was Bill Green, one of these, along with Carmen DeSapio and Lawrence himself and Mayor Daley, you know, that club that was so important in those days. And they came to impress me. We're going to run respectable Democrats in the suburban counties, which were all, you know, solid Republican then. So we'd very much like you to run in the 9th District. Well, the 9th District, part of it was ex-urban, suburban Philadelphia. Most of Chester County was rural, and Lancaster County, the other county making up this district, they had an open season on Democrats there. 25% was about the average vote that Democratic candidates for Congress had received. That's partly because, you know, it was all just a formality. You're nominated, well, wait till the election and see how many votes you got. No point in fighting it. So with Peggy's assent, I said, okay, yes. I was tempted not because I thought I could win at all. In fact, Peggy would never have agreed if she thought, I mean, she didn't want to go to Washington with small kids. But to my mind, it was a chance to get out and do some campaigning and learn about different parts of this very diverse district. Some of Ab's stories reminded me very much of the kinds of places that I eventually got to. Columbia, Pennsylvania, on the banks of the Susquehanna, a very small steel town, sort of a little gem of democracy in the midst of this Republican hypocrisy, and so on. I learned then, as Tip O'Neill told me later, not me, but the country, all politics is indeed local. Mm-hmm. I came with a bundle of things I would do if I were in Congress, to the schools, you know, programs of this, that, and the other. And if I'm, you know, talking to one individual who'd say, yeah, but what are you going to do about such and such a road? And this, that, and the other. And the best I could do, rather belatedly, is I'd say, I'm going to set up an office in Lancaster where you folks can come and give me your complaints and we'll tend to them right there. That was a little resonant, you know. So I did campaign a lot, learned a lot, and when it was over, I had 40% of the vote, which was, I think, surprised the Republicans a little bit. I walked over to my opponent at their headquarters and shook his hand. Nice guy. Had never done anything particular in Congress except vote a conservative way. And we became very good friends. And Peggy told me we're through with politics and I got back to academic work. A little while later, a couple of years later, we were in Ethiopia. I needed to get the Supreme Court reports and a lot of other federal statutes and so on. I wrote to my buddy Paul Daig, still in Congress, and said, can you get these things and shipped out free to us? And he wrote back, certainly, and give my regards to your great emperor and so on.
Yeah.
That's about the only payoff my career brought. I did have the sense from talking to people that I had moved towards visibility and, you know, I could go on and get somewhere if I would stick with it. But I'm glad we didn't.
This lunch with Jackson and the clerks, you remember Howard Treenans happened to be in town and was with you guys at that lunch?
No. Was he?
Uh-huh.
I don't remember that. But then, you know, that's the problem, John, at least with me.
Right.
I don't remember a lot of things.
No, this is a trivial point. He just happened to write Jackson a thank you letter because he wasn't a clerk, he was a former clerk.
Well, a smart thing to do.
So there's a little, so it gives me the date, and he says that Jackson discussed his experience in New York and government practice. He emphatically recommended that a young lawyer should maintain a political party affiliation but avoid an active political life until you'd achieved personal independence. So, some sort of balance issue.
Yeah.
And then
I think I can understand that.
That there was also some discussion of good and evil in the FBI.
Well, I probably should have remembered that first and foremost, but I don't. Well, that's interesting.
So spring of '53. I don't want Greg to miss this, but I want you to cover the Hickory Hill McLean carpool experiences.
Well, it was a very irregular carpool.
Where were you and Peggy
couple
living?
of times.
I mean, we know RFD 1 McLean, that's the address. But.
Well, it was a cottage, a very small but sort of brand new little cottage on a place then owned by the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, very high in the Interior Department, wonderful guy. And he had built this little cottage. He had, I don't know, 35, 40 acres, maybe more.
Do you recall his name?
Yeah, Al Wolf. And his wife was lovely. They were a little older than we were, but, they were of our generation, basically. And so we took to them and had a happy time there. And as I said, it was about 2 estates down, maybe a little more from Hickory Hill. Mm-hmm.
Orient me. If you're standing facing Hickory Hill, you're on Old Chain Bridge Road looking at the front of the house.
Yeah.
And sort of deep behind the house through the woods would be Dolly Madison Parkway.
That didn't exist.
That didn't exist, no. Okay. So just if you look at
deep behind you would be probably a lovely meadow down to a nice-sized stream that ran into the Potomac.
Behind your back.
And it would be wooded all along it, and it was great birding. I used to walk way down almost to Chain Bridge, and nothing that, obscured that. It was all pristine woodland water shore.
Okay. So this Wolf property, if you're facing the front door of Hickory Hill, where is it?
facing the front. It faced Chain Bridge Road just as Hickory Hill did.
Okay.
It was a little set further back,
Okay.
and the cottage still further back.
And it's further out, away from Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, towards McLean, which was simply a
center of
crossroads. There was no center, actually. It was a crossroads and a store, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me add to that.
Well, we haven't talked about the Jackson part. So you're living there. Jackson's obviously living at Hickory Hill.
Yeah.
Then what happened?
Well, nothing particular. As I said, he did give me a ride, volunteered to once or twice. We ran across each other, and they were nice rides, relatively easy to talk to him. Talk of many things. Fascinated me, for example, that it'd be a good thing to steer the conversation to Shakespeare. He could whip up a Shakespearean character and quote, and one of my life's passion is Shakespeare, that he could invent so many different people and see life in so many forms. So there was that, or other sources, historical. As, for example, his quote in the Steel Seizure case from the Sir Edward Cook. Now, that's a very famous case of Sir Edward Cook. The king says, then I am to be under the law, which it is treason to say. All the judges, according to Cook, fell to their knees, except Cook stood up. Thus saith Bracton, blah, blah, blah. That's a case that actually shaped early American understanding. I mean, our forefather lawyers knew that case, I'm sure.
Right. Well, that's pretty good. You remember you're riding in Jackson's convertible talking about Shakespeare.
Yeah, and I don't get these as profound conversations. Yeah, no, it was nice and pleasant.
And you were there for 2 years, so obviously he was familiar with you.
Yeah.
And he at some point learned that you lived nearby.
Yeah.
And I think you told me that you'd kind of hang around at departure time if you needed a ride. And
no, well, these would be just offhand if I met him, and he knew, I think, that Peggy often took me in because she needed the car for something. That's it. I would not play on that too much. I wish I could give you vital information. Reinforced my perception of Jackson as being a very unusual, learned man, probably self-taught, but just the kind of intellectual curiosity that makes one a fascinating character. And I have come to believe, of course, later that his contributions to the Nuremberg trial were, in some ways, the greatest part of his career, and left a most enduring legacy and a most important one. Because those trials really brought it created a new foundation for international law in many ways. Don't want to get into all that now. But
what do you remember of his car?
It was a sporty convertible. I can't remember the make. I suppose the fashion of those days had big fenders and all that stuff, but I don't remember very clearly. Light blue. He liked to ride with the top down,
And what was the road to McLean? Was there the parkway going out the river at that point?
There was nothing on the Virginia side, no parkway.
Okay.
There we took, we went across Chain Bridge and turned right on, I don't remember the name of the road, followed along the shore of the Potomac pretty well, and till you went up and got on something called MacArthur Boulevard and swept down into along the Potomac, not far from the State Department, so on, cut into Constitution Avenue, zip up to the Supreme Court.
So it was the Washington side from Chain Bridge down to the court.
Yeah, and it was an easy ride. I mean, I'm sure we got there quicker then than you can possibly do now with all these.
You're darn right.
And it was a nice ride, and.
He dropped you off at your place?
Yeah, he dropped me off at the gate.
Did you ever get to Hickory Hill?
No,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Okay.
I want to tell you about another neighbor that both Peggy and I discovered, and that is one evening this friend come out from Washington, this guy, he was sort of an operator, and he said, I'm going down, just down the road to a girl's party. Her name is Jackie Bouvier, and I'll take you along as my guest. And so we went down to Jackie Bouvier's party and met her. She was then the inquiring photographer for the Washington Post. And her job was to stop people on some busy street and ask them a question and then take their picture. And that was her work, and that was being done. So we met Jackie Bouvier, and along with Jackson, wish I'd gotten to know her more intimately, but that was that neighbor. This was just a little bit before, I think, well, I don't know how much before John
Right. They
JFK.
got married, I think, in '53, so it's not
Was
long.
it 53?
Yeah,
Really?
I think so.
Uh-huh. Well, maybe it was going on then, but I don't recall meeting him at this. You did meet a lot of high society people at her parties. In fact, yeah, that was before our son was born. Peggy had been pregnant, but
Okay.
and we decided we would drive to California, not to Bill's wedding, but. Just because of a wonderful thing to do. And we had some friends to see along the way, and one guy in my law school class, he and his wife, he was pulled into the Marines, Korea, called back, and he was at Camp Pendleton. So we did spend that summer going to California and back, a month and a half worth of driving.
Wow.
Very interesting, because there were no super highways then,
Right.
and lots of things to see.
Back to the phrase suicide pact. I think
Yeah.
you've heard a story about where that originated.
Well, Murray Schwartz, as I said, he was my predecessor and Howard's predecessor. He, former chief clerk before Howie came in, took that. And he told me that it had been invented when Jackson was riding in the convertible with the top down. They got around to quipping about this case, I think, and law clerk made some noise about, I don't know what he said, and Jackson said, that's it, suicide pact. Something like that. It all, boom, popped into his head on that kind of an occasion.
He did some of his writing in non-office settings. I mean, I think he was constantly, sort of writing in his mind.
I would suppose because he's that kind of, people who write that way don't just say, once they sit down at my desk, well, now my mind is going to do this.
A couple of cases I wanted to ask you about, just if they're memory points, particularly from the second clerkship year. The Reynolds case, which was a state secrets,
Yeah.
and Jackson is one of the dissenters in that case. The government wins.
Yeah.
Was that a big deal?
that was a very important case, and I haven't reviewed it for this session because I didn't think it would be relevant, but my recollection
It's
is...
the first big executive power case after Steel Seizure.
Yes, indeed, and although in a somewhat different
context.
issue, a privilege, really.
Right.
And what we struggled for, Carl Hawkins particularly, I think he drafted it, but we all tried to help him because we were all worried about the privileges claimed by the government. And here you'll have to help me because we did really put some limits on this privilege. The case can easily be overread, I think, that the privilege granted was so broad. And I'm sorry, I would have to go back to remember what we did.
No, I'm not.
You got to remember, my career has taken me far, far away from these things and constitutional law, American ones.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking for the 52, 53.
Well,
if one pops up.
I can, reflect on that and so on. I'm sure more might come to mind if I tried, but certainly a rereading of the Chief's decision there would be, would help jog my memory.
What about Terry versus Adams?
That was the Jaybird case.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that was
it's a race case. It's a case about race in the Brown period.
Well, it was the Jaybird primary, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Terry versus Adams.
Right.
It's such a kind of a name for a case. It seems to me Terry versus Adams cases might be, just the kinds of names you see in Supreme Court report. Never mind. In the first place, that was sort of a bizarre case. Hard to believe when you read the statement of facts in the briefs. And it was one that I think the court puzzled over, quite carefully and with differences of opinion. I forget who dissented in that. Do you remember?
No.
Minton, I think, wrote the dissent.
Okay.
Once again, you see, I could pull these things together, I guess, a little bit.
But I don't mean these as research projects. I'm wondering if they're memory points. How about Brown versus Allen, which is a finality habeas case? It was a very big matter Bill Rehnquist worked on for Jackson.
Right, because Bill wanted to cut the stream off.
Yeah. And I don't think Vincent felt differently, particularly.
Well, he certainly wanted to take some measures. And again, I remember this, many of us, certainly myself, thought this is a very important, touchy issue that needs to be settled very carefully. But honestly, I can't, until I go back again on these things and jog my memory, such as it is.
Is it a Bill Rehnquist memory? You remember Brown versus Allen being a real project or a priority of his?
I don't remember that. I'm pretty sure I don't. I do remember that generally his project was to produce some kind of finality for getting into the federal courts, habeas corpus review.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
I do remember that.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's the culmination of your clerkship, isn't it?
right. Right.
It's a huge topic, I'm sure, but
Yeah.
what?
I can give you one point because this is certainly important to the Jackson project. One of my few instances of contact with Jackson face to face in relation to a case. Douglas issued the stay. I heard on the news that he'd done so. Had a call from the chief's secretary saying the chief wants to see you right away, you know. So I got in the car, obviously, and went on in. She ushered me into the office, and there was Jackson and the chief sitting together. It was clear to me from the moment we said good morning that they were in high dudgeon, angry. And I think this has been subsequently recorded in scholarly accounts of all this and so on. But I can vouch for the truth of that. I'd been called in to, I forget, make some arrangements with the clerks and, as I recall, get, why from the clerk of the court, I don't know, but get a sort of a confirmation that the chief can immediately confirm, convene the court when it's gone into recess. In other words, call everybody back, something like that.
As a matter of power?
Yeah, procedure, power, what are the precedents for this? I guess the chief thought maybe the clerk of the court, Wiley, nice guy, was more competent than I was to know about this. Probably accurately.
Yeah, the pronunciation
Willie was the
Willie or
clerk's name.
Wiley?
Willie.
Okay.
Willie, yeah. Because, you know, I was wandering all around, but after the court had been convened or asked to be convened, Frankfurter snappily said to, I have this on the authority of Alex Bickle, that Frankfurter called the chief and said, on what authority are you doing this, calling us all back? And according to Alex Bickle, the chief said, because Willie told me I could. We had a great laughs over that.
Was there any Vinson or Vincent Jackson coordination with the Justice Department in between the Douglas stay and the special term?
What do you mean coordination with the Justice Department?
Well, I don't want to put loaded words on it, but maybe ex parte contact.
I don't know. I would certainly not testify to that. It may have been it had been in there, I think, for some time. I don't know how long before I arrived. I sat down and, you know, we were discussing this thing, and they made it clear this is a very serious matter. I think the anger was that all this comes out in the last minute, hadn't been raised before. Why wasn't it raised before? And Doug was doing it, taking it on his own to issue the stay.
As he leaves town.
As he leaves town, he was always the first guy to get out of town,
Not his,
the last guy to get back in
right.
October.
Right. Were you the clerk on the Rosenbergs in the Vinson chamber? Or was there?
Rosenberg's been around for a long time. My recollection is that Newt did the first Rosenberg memo. Frankfurter, I mean, the whole thing is such a bizarre history. Frankfurter constantly wanted the court to hear that simply because of death case, and he thought that federal death cases, the court should hear them, unless it was completely frivolous. And he said, we do this, and then that will sort of give the sentence a legitimacy. I think he thought that was implicit. And the bizarre thing is that in the final Rosenberg decision in relation to Douglas's stay, Frankfurter votes no. We can't hear this case. Too late. They'd switched stream because Douglas had been, deny these cert petitions.
Right.
I'd have to go back again to trace this.
Jackson is with Frankfurter in that.
Yeah, it's like, as to quote Jackson, it's like switching partners at a quadrille or something.
The spring of '53, May of '53, Jackson misses a couple of weeks because he's in the hospital for a thyroid operation. Do you remember anything about that, Jackson health?
No, I don't, and I didn't know, I don't recall any discussion of his health. So.
Okay. As far as you knew, he was healthy, looked...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, again, there may be things, one of the interesting things to me is that when I gather these guys here, we begin to talk about various things. Suddenly, yeah, I do remember that now. It's sort of an interaction that, because we do, I think, remember different things. And I think the phenomena I'm experiencing, others are also. I mean, I'm sure there are people here like Ab who remembers everything perfectly. But
did you know Jackson's secretary, Elsie Douglas?
a little bit. I don't know exactly why or how. I think there were Christmas parties or occasions where we met these young ladies. And as I recall, she's a very nice person.
Okay. His messenger, Harry Parker? Do you have any memory of...
These guys, I guess he was one of them. They were elderly, black men, very, just what you would see out of a Gone with the Wind, that kind of character. Robinson was ours. It was said he had been Justice McReynolds' messenger, which to my mind took him back in the mists of time. But he was just a lovely, kindly person, remembered our names and very courteous to us, far more than we deserved and so on. A unique feature of the court, because I think all of the so-called messengers were of this class of Negroes, as they then were. Yeah.
Was it striking or odd or maybe even jarring as, segregation and racial progress is on the docket to have this personnel arrangement, which is really, 19th century?
I don't know what it was to others, John, but to me, those guys, I had tremendous respect for them because they were gentlemen. At the same time, I thought, my God, this is right out of, the Southern book about all this, and it's a contradiction, and it certainly left a sort of an incongruence when the segregation issue was to be argued. Needless to say, I never discussed it with Robinson.
Right. Or with Vincent.
Yeah, or with either one.
Okay. Did you know Jackson's children?
No.
Either his son William or his daughter Mary?
No, I knew nothing of them, in fact.
Okay. Anything else in the Jackson realm that is a memory or a perspective that we might be interested in?
Probably so. Things pop up. As I said, he was to me such an interesting guy. It's like the Rosenberg thing. That kind of came to my memory at some point along in this episode. I had really forgotten that. And along with it came, that day they vacated the stay, and that was it. It was a University of Chicago professor, wasn't it, who represented, in part, he was on the Rosenberg team. Trying to remember the name. Pretty sure he was Chicago, an academic.
You're talking about having the black messengers in the court. Just the other day, watching the C-SPAN event of the Queen Elizabeth and the President. It was sort of a state dinner. And sure enough, this white-haired black gentleman, well-dressed, but he was the guy sitting the Queen, sitting, the President. It was, talking about incongruous, you would have expected some military guy.
Yeah.
But no, it was some 65-year-old. To him, I'm sure it was an honor to be able to see the Queen. My God, it was just nothing but it was a visual impact to me.
I suppose the White House staff, has some of the same features as the Supreme Court staff, and you have these guys who go on and live forever. Presidents come, presidents go, but I live forever.
And someday they'll do an oral history. While John's looking, just
here are two names. John Finnerty is the Rosenberg's attorney who's presenting the late 11th hour original habeas petition to the court.
Yeah.
And then there's also someone who's litigating as a next friend of the Rosenbergs, whose name is Edelman.
Yeah, no.
I don't know if
Are there any other advocates in there? I may have this wrong, but let me just, I walked out, the whole thing left a very bitter taste in my mouth. It wasn't so much, about the merits of this, it was the way it was done. And it just didn't seem to me it brought any credit on the court to have acted in this way precipitously and so on. And announced its decision and said we'll write our opinions later on, that sort of stuff. So I walked out, and for some reason I guess because I was going to meet Peggy, I walked down the steps, the long steps going up to the temple entrance of the court, not down the garage and get my car and go out the back, but that way. And I suddenly found myself in the middle of a kind of a news session where the Rosenberg lawyers, or some of them at least, were commenting to networks, I guess, on this decision. And one of them just got up and he was in blind fury. This is the blackest day in the history of this court. You'll live to regret it forever. And he went on. I was somehow just fascinated by his spiel there. And just one of those things that is in your memory somewhere. It comes up. It was a sorry day.
Yeah.
There was so much sorry business done by the court when we were there. I wish somebody had said that.
Daniel Marshall was another of the attorneys, and a fellow named Block.
Yeah, Block, that's it, wasn't it?
B-L-O-C-H, Block.
Emmanuel, or what is it?
I think that's right. Let me look for his first name.
And I think he taught it at Chicago. Ab would know.
Okay.
I guess he would know.
He was the one who was furious?
Yeah, he was the one, I'm quite sure. At least that was my impression. It was he.
And does that connect to Jackson in any direct way, or it's just
No, it's just part of
the business?
that day almost. Well, it wasn't the same day, obviously, but
Right.
very short period.
Right. Were you surprised when Vincent dropped dead just a few months after you left the clerkship?
In a sense, no. In the sense that I didn't think he was in good shape at all. He just abused himself by staying out late, drinking, smoking, not just ordinary smoking, but one after another. That kind of life. But he was, I was surprised when I learned he was only 63, I think. How young he was. He looked like,
Right.
yeah, no. I think I was still, I don't think I was off the payroll then.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure because I know I stayed on. We didn't leave Washington until October,
Okay.
Peggy and I, and I did things to help the transition. Not anything important, but.
Yeah, the new clerks, at whatever time the payroll was going to shift over, were, for that 53 term, were Bill Oliver,
Bill
Pollock, and Richard Flynn. Those are the names I have.
Right. No, Bill was destined to become the new clerk, and Pollock, I guess I do remember, but not well at all. We had very little time together.
Okay.
Speaking of time,
Yeah, Jim, this has been great. Super.
thank you
No.
so much.